The morning of February 15th, 1943, above Guadalcanal's humid skies, Lieutenant Sakai Saburo banked his Mitsubishi A6M Zero through scattered clouds at 14,000 feet. He had shot down 64 Allied aircraft in 18 months of combat. His hands knew every tremor of his fighter's controls, every sound the Sakai engine made at different throttle settings. The Zero could outmaneuver anything the Americans had thrown at them. It could outclimb their Wildcats. It could outturn their P-38s. For 2 years, Sakai and pilots like him had owned these skies. Then he saw it. A dark blue fighter with inverted gull wings dove from above, its massive nose housing an engine that sounded like thunder compressed into metal. The American pilot didn't attempt to turn with him. He didn't need to. The fighter, what the Americans called the Corsair, simply accelerated away in a climb so steep and so fast that Sakai's Zero, pushed to full throttle, fell behind as if it were standing still. The sound alone was different. Not the high whine of a Japanese radial engine working at its limits, but a deep, sustained roar that spoke of reserves of power Sakai had never encountered in aerial combat. He would survive that encounter. Many of his fellow pilots would not. Within 18 months, the F4U Corsair would destroy over 2,140 Japanese aircraft, including hundreds of Zeros, while losing only a fraction of that number in return. The question that would haunt Japanese aviators across the Pacific wasn't simply how the Americans had built such a machine. It was how they had built so many of them, and why Japanese intelligence had so catastrophically underestimated what American industry could achieve when fully mobilized for war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of a psychological collapse hidden inside technical specifications. It's about what happens when pilots trained to believe in the superiority of their equipment and the righteousness of their cause encounter overwhelming material evidence that both assumptions were built on catastrophic miscalculations. It's about the specific moment when Japan's most experienced aviators realized they were flying obsolete machines against an industrial power that could afford to make each new fighter twice as powerful as the last, and to produce them in quantities that turned individual pilot skill into a temporary advantage in a losing war of attrition. To understand the shock of the Corsair's arrival, you must first understand the world Japanese pilots inhabited in early 1942, and why they had every reason to believe their Zero was the finest fighter aircraft in the world. When the Imperial Japanese Navy committed to war with the United States in December 1941, its carrier-based fighter pilots flew what was arguably the most advanced naval fighter on Earth. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero represented a specific set of design compromises that prioritized range, maneuverability, and climb rate over everything else. Its Nakajima Sakai 14-cylinder radial engine produced 1,130 horsepower. Modest by the standards of contemporary American or German fighters, but sufficient for a machine that achieved its performance through radical weight reduction. The Zero weighed just over 5,000 pounds fully loaded. American fighters of the same era weighed nearly 8,000. This weight advantage translated into extraordinary agility. In a turning fight, a Zero could complete a full circle in roughly 16 seconds at optimal speed. An American F4F Wildcat took 22 seconds. That 6-second difference meant a Zero pilot who understood his aircraft's capabilities could position himself behind almost any Allied fighter in the Pacific theater within 2 or 3 turns, bringing his two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns to bear at close range. Japanese pilot training reinforced this tactical approach. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators accumulated more flight hours than their American counterparts. The curriculum emphasized individual initiative, aggressive pursuit, and the cultivation of what Japanese doctrine called seishin, fighting spirit. Pilots were taught that skill and determination could overcome material disadvantages. The Zero's design embodied this philosophy. It was a weapon for an elite force of highly trained specialists who would dominate through superior technique and resolve. And for the first 6 months of the Pacific War, this belief system was validated by overwhelming tactical success. At Pearl Harbor, Zero's flying escort for Japanese bombers encountered minimal air opposition. Over the Philippines, they swept American P-40s from the skies. In the Dutch East Indies, they outmaneuvered British Hurricanes and Australian Buffaloes. By March 1942, Japanese forces controlled a vast arc of territory from Burma to the Solomon Islands, and their fighter pilots had established kill ratios of 10 to 1 or better against Allied aircraft. The men who flew these missions weren't delusional. They were professionals who had witnessed their own superiority demonstrated in combat after combat. Lieutenant Nishizawa Hiroyoshi, who would become one of Japan's highest-scoring aces, described the Zero in his diary as a sword forged by the gods, given to us to cleanse the Pacific of Western corruption. Commander Shigematsu Yasuhiko, a veteran of the China campaigns, wrote in a report to Naval Aviation Headquarters that the psychological impact of the Zero on enemy pilots is as valuable as its technical advantages. They know they cannot match us in single combat. This confidence was reinforced by Japanese propaganda, which emphasized racial and cultural superiority. Pilots were told that Western decadence had weakened America's will to fight, that Americans were too soft and individualistic to match Japanese discipline and sacrifice. The early victories seemed to confirm this narrative. When the Americans retreated from the Philippines, when they abandoned Wake Island, when they pulled back from Java, Japanese aviators saw evidence that their training cadre had been correct. The Americans could produce more aircraft, perhaps, but they could not produce better pilots or better fighting spirit. But beneath this surface confidence, there were already signs that Japanese strategic thinking was built on fundamental miscalculations about American industrial capacity. The Zero's lightweight construction was not purely a design choice. It reflected Japan's limited access to high-grade aluminum and advanced alloys. The Sake engine's modest horsepower output was the best Japan's manufacturing sector could mass-produce with available resources and tooling. The lack of armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks wasn't a deliberate trade-off for performance. It was a necessity imposed by material constraints that Japanese planners hoped would be offset by pilot skill and aggressive tactics. Japan's pre-war leadership had studied American industrial output. They knew the United States produced more steel, more aluminum, more machine tools, and more trained engineers than Japan. But they had convinced themselves that American production would not be fully converted to military purposes, that American public opinion would not support the sustained casualties required for a Pacific offensive, and that Japan's early victories would force a negotiated settlement before American material advantages became decisive. These assumptions were embedded in every aspect of Japanese military planning, including aircraft development. The Zero's design specifications reflected what Japan could build in the late 1930s with the resources available. Its maximum speed of 332 miles per hour at 15,000 feet was competitive with American fighters of that era. Its range of 1,940 miles was extraordinary, allowing Japanese carriers to strike targets far beyond the operational radius of American naval aviation. But the Zero's airframe and engine had almost no margin for improvement. The Sake engine was already operating near its maximum reliable output. Adding more armor or weapons would degrade the aircraft's maneuverability and range. The Zero that fought in 1942 was essentially the best version of itself that Japan's industrial base could produce. American aircraft development followed a different trajectory, one rooted in assumptions about industrial warfare that Japanese planners fundamentally misunderstood. When the United States Navy issued its request for a carrier-based fighter in February 1938, the specifications demanded high speed, heavy armament, and long range, but did not initially prioritize extreme maneuverability. The Navy expected its fighters to protect carrier task forces from enemy bombers, a mission that required speed and climbing ability more than turning performance. The contract was awarded to Chance Vought Aircraft, which designed a fighter around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. The R-2800 was an engineering achievement that illustrated the gap between American and Japanese industrial capabilities. It was an 18-cylinder, two-row radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower in its initial variants, and would eventually be developed to produce 2,380 horsepower in the versions used by Corsairs in combat. This was more than double the power output of the Zero's Sake engine. The R-2800 weighed over 2,000 pounds, heavier than the entire Zero's engine and fuel system combined. It required precision manufacturing tolerances, high-grade aluminum alloys, and advanced metallurgy for its cylinder heads and crankshaft. Japan did not have the industrial infrastructure to manufacture such an engine in quantity, even if its engineers had designed one. The Corsair's airframe was built around this massive engine. Its inverted gull wing design was not an aesthetic choice, but an engineering solution to a specific problem. The R-2800 required a 13-foot 4-inch propeller to absorb its power output efficiently, and that enormous propeller needed ground clearance for carrier operations. By bending the wing upward from the fuselage and then angling it downward to the wingtips, Vaught's engineers could use shorter, stronger landing gear while maintaining the necessary propeller clearance. The design also reduced drag by allowing the landing gear to retract into the wing at its thickest point. The first F4U prototype flew in May 1940 and immediately demonstrated performance that exceeded the Navy's specifications. In initial tests, it reached 405 miles per hour in level flight, the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour. It could climb to 20,000 feet in 7.5 minutes. It could dive at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour without structural failure. These numbers represented a qualitative leap beyond existing carrier fighters, but they also revealed significant problems that would delay the Corsair's entry into combat. The Corsair's long nose and narrow landing gear made carrier landings extremely difficult. Pilots had minimal forward visibility during the final approach. The aircraft had a tendency to stall unpredictably during the slow-speed turns required for carrier operations. The main landing gear tended to bounce on hard landings, sometimes causing the aircraft to flip over. Between 1940 and 1942, as American industrial mobilization accelerated, Vought engineers worked to resolve these issues through modifications to the landing gear, the wing design, and the cockpit positioning. While these modifications continued, the United States Marine Corps, desperate for high-performance fighters to support its island-hopping campaigns, accepted the Corsair for land-based operations. The first Marine Corps squadron to receive F4U-1s was VMF 124, which deployed to Guadalcanal in February 1943. The pilots who flew these early Corsairs into combat were not the most experienced aviators in American service. Many had fewer than 300 flight hours. They were learning tactics for a new aircraft, while simultaneously facing Japanese pilots who had been in continuous combat since 1941 or earlier. What the American pilots lacked in experience, they compensated for with overwhelming material advantages. The Corsair they flew into combat carried 6 50-caliber machine guns, each loaded with 400 rounds. The total weight of fire from all 6 guns was nearly 4 times that of a Zero's armament. The Corsair's armor plating protected the pilot and critical engine components from ground fire and from the Zero's 7.7mm machine guns. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented the catastrophic fires that destroyed so many Japanese aircraft after even minor hits. And beneath all these advantages was the fundamental advantage of power. 2,000 horsepower available at the pilot's throttle, translating to acceleration and climb rates that Japanese fighters could not match. The tactical implications of this power became apparent in the first major engagements. On February 14, 1943, VMF 124 flew its first combat mission over Guadalcanal. Captain Harold Bauer led a section of 4 Corsairs on a patrol when they encountered a formation of 12 Zeros escorting bombers toward American positions. Bauer's after-action report, filed with Marine Air Group 21, described the engagement in language that revealed how the Corsair's power changed fundamental assumptions about fighter combat. We attacked from above with a speed advantage of at least 100 miles per hour. I selected a Zero in the rear of the formation and opened fire at 400 yards, observing strikes on the fuselage and wing route. The Zero attempted to turn left, but I was able to stay in position through the first 30 degrees of his turn before my speed carried me past. I pushed the throttle to full power and climbed back to altitude. The entire maneuver, from initial dive to return to attacking position, took approximately 45 seconds. The Zero I had damaged was still completing its evasive turn when I re-engaged from a different angle. This was the new tactical reality. Corsair pilots didn't need to outturn the Zero. They could attack at high speed, using their power advantage to control the engagement geometry. If a Zero pilot attempted to turn into them, they could simply accelerate away, climbing back to altitude to set up another diving attack. The Zero's superior maneuverability became irrelevant if the Corsair pilot refused to engage in a turning fight. American doctrine adapted quickly to exploit this advantage. Slash and dash became the standard tactic. Dive at high speed, fire a short burst, use excess energy to climb away before the enemy could react. Japanese pilots had no effective counter to this tactic. Their training had prepared them for close-range, low-speed turning fights where individual skill determined the outcome. The Corsair's tactics denied them the opportunity to use their training. Petty Officer Fujita Ioso, a Zero pilot who survived multiple encounters with Corsairs before being shot down in June 1943, described the psychological impact in his post-war testimony to American interrogators. We were told that American pilots were cowards who would not engage us directly. But when we fought the Corsairs, we understood that they were not cowards. They were simply using their aircraft correctly, while we were locked into tactics that our machines could no longer execute successfully. When a Corsair dove on us, we would turn to meet it, expecting the American pilot to follow us into the turn, but he would fire his guns and then pull up and away before we could complete our turn. By the time we had reversed to chase him, he was already 2,000 feet above us, preparing to attack again. We could never catch him. We could never force him to fight at slow speed where the Zero's advantages would matter. This wasn't merely a tactical problem. It was a revelation about the nature of the war Japan was fighting. Every Corsair that appeared over the Solomons or the Marshalls represented industrial capacity that Japan could not match. The R-2800 engine alone required manufacturing capabilities that exceeded Japan's entire aviation engine production infrastructure. The United States was producing Corsairs at a rate of more than 400 per month by mid-1943. Japan's total fighter production, including all types, averaged around 600 aircraft per month during the same period, and those numbers were declining as Allied bombing disrupted manufacturing facilities and supply chains. Japanese pilots began to understand they were fighting not just superior aircraft, but an enemy that could replace losses faster than Japan could train new pilots. In early 1943, when both navies were roughly matched in carrier strength, the loss of experienced pilots meant more to Japan than the loss of aircraft. A Zero that was shot down could theoretically be replaced within weeks. A pilot with 2 years of combat experience could not be replaced at all. Japan's pre-war training program had produced roughly 100 carrier-qualified pilots per year. That program had been designed for peacetime attrition rates, not for combat against an enemy that was killing Japanese aviators at a rate of 50 to 70 per month. The kill ratios documented in Marine Corps and Navy records tell the story of this disparity with brutal clarity. Between February 1943 and August 1944, F4U Corsairs in the Solomon Islands campaign achieved an overall kill ratio of 11-1 against Japanese aircraft. VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep squadron led by Major Gregory Boyington, claimed 97 confirmed kills against 8 Corsairs lost in aerial combat during its 84 days of operations. VMF 215 achieved a ratio of nearly 13-1. These weren't statistical anomalies. They represented the systemic advantage of pilots flying aircraft that could dictate the terms of every engagement. The Corsair's impact went beyond simple kill statistics. Its presence forced Japanese commanders to make increasingly desperate tactical decisions. By mid-1943, Japanese fighters were ordered to ignore Corsairs and focus on attacking American bombers, a tacit admission that attempting to fight Corsairs for air superiority was unsustainable. This shift meant American bombers could operate with reduced fighter escort, freeing Corsairs to conduct offensive sweeps against Japanese airfields and shipping. Lieutenant Kano Naoshi, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces, wrote in his diary in August 1943 about the psychological toll of fighting Corsairs with increasingly obsolete aircraft. "We are samurai armed with bamboo swords, facing enemies with steel blades. Our courage is not in question. Our skill has been proven in 2 years of combat. But we are being sent to die in aircraft that cannot compete with what the Americans are now bringing to battle. Every mission, we lose pilots who cannot be replaced. Every mission, there are more Corsairs and fewer Zeros. The mathematics of this situation are simple, and they are terrible." The technological gap continued to widen. In late 1943, the Navy began deploying F4U 1A variants with modifications that finally made the Corsair suitable for carrier operations. The raised pilot seat improved visibility. Modifications to the landing gear reduced the bounce tendency. By early 1944, Corsairs were operating from American carriers, giving the Navy the ability to project overwhelming air power across the Pacific. Each Essex-class carrier could deploy 36 fighters in addition to its bombers and torpedo aircraft. A 3-carrier task force could put over 100 Corsairs into the air, a concentration of combat power that Japanese forces could not match. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the complete collapse of Japanese naval aviation effectiveness. In what American pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Carrier-based Corsairs and Hellcats destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day while losing fewer than 30 of their own. Japanese pilots, many of them hastily trained replacements with less than 100 hours of flight time, were massacred. They attempted tactics that had worked in 1942 against Wildcats, and discovered that those tactics were suicide against Corsairs that could outrun them, outclimb them, outdive them, and absorb damage that would destroy a Zero. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Warrant Officer Takahashi Sadao survived the Philippine Sea Battle and recorded his experiences in a letter that was later recovered by American forces. His description captures the psychological state of Japanese pilots in the final year of the war. "We took off knowing we would not return. Our aircraft were inferior, our training was inadequate, but we were told that our spirit would overcome these material disadvantages. When I saw the American formations, I understood that spirit alone could not defeat aircraft that were simply better in every measurable way. I fired at a Corsair from behind, saw my bullets strike its fuselage, and watched it continue flying as if nothing had happened. Then it turned toward me, and I knew I was dead. Only luck saved me. Another Zero drew the American's attention before he could finish his attack. I limped back to the carrier, with half my fuel gone and bullet holes in my wing. That was the last mission I flew from a carrier. Within a week, our ship was sunk by American aircraft. The final 18 months of the Pacific War saw the Corsair evolve from a tactical advantage into a symbol of industrial dominance that Japanese forces had no answer for. As American forces advanced through the Central Pacific and reclaimed the Philippines, Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons operated from forward bases that allowed them to maintain continuous pressure on Japanese positions. The F4U 1D variant, introduced in 1944, could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs or 8 5-inch rockets, in addition to its 6 machine guns, transforming the Corsair from a pure fighter into a versatile strike aircraft that could destroy ground targets, shipping, and enemy aircraft with equal effectiveness. Japanese attempts to develop competitive fighters came too late and in insufficient numbers. The Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden, which entered service in late 1943, could match some of the Corsair's performance characteristics, but only a few hundred were built before American bombing disrupted production. The Mitsubishi A7M Zero, designed specifically to exceed the Corsair's capabilities, never entered mass production. Even if these aircraft had been available in quantity, Japan lacked the fuel, the trained pilots, and the logistical infrastructure to deploy them effectively. By 1945, Japanese aviation fuel was being manufactured from pine tree roots due to the destruction of conventional refineries. Pilots were receiving less than 50 hours of training before being sent into combat. Aircraft were being dispersed to hidden airfields to avoid destruction on the ground, making coordination and maintenance nearly impossible. The Corsair's kill total continued to climb through the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Marine Fighter Squadron 323, flying from Okinawa, claimed over 124 confirmed kills between April and June 1945. Lieutenant Colonel Archie Donohue's VMF 451 destroyed 65 Japanese aircraft in a single month during the Okinawa campaign. These weren't battles. They were systematic destruction of an air force that no longer had the resources to resist effectively. The final confirmation of the Corsair's dominance came in a statistic that Japanese military historians would struggle to explain in the post-war period. Of the 2,140 Japanese aircraft destroyed by Corsairs between February 1943 and August 1945, over 60% were Zero variants, the fighter that had begun the war as the most advanced carrier aircraft in the world and ended it as a symbol of Japan's failed assumptions about industrial warfare. The kill ratio for Corsair versus Zero engagements was documented at approximately 11-1. Meaning that for every Corsair lost in air combat with Zeros, 11 Japanese fighters were destroyed. These numbers represented more than tactical superiority. They documented the collapse of an entire strategic framework. Japan had entered the war believing that superior fighting spirit and better trained pilots could offset material disadvantages. The Zero's design embodied this philosophy: extreme performance achieved through weight reduction and the acceptance of vulnerability. The Corsair represented the opposite approach: overwhelming power applied through industrial mass production. Its 2,380 horsepower engine wasn't just more powerful than the Zero's power plant. It was more powerful than many bomber engines of the era. The United States had built a fighter that didn't need to make compromises between speed, armor, armament, and range, because American industry could manufacture engines large enough and airframes strong enough to have all these characteristics simultaneously. Japanese pilots understood this reality long before their commanders acknowledged it officially. Petty Officer Sakai Saburo, who had encountered his first Corsair over Guadalcanal in February 1943, survived the war and wrote extensively about his experiences. In his memoir, published in 1957, he reflected on the moment he realized Japan could not win the air war. It was not one battle or one engagement. It was the accumulation of encounters where we did everything correctly according to our training, and still lost. We would bounce American formations from above, using the sun and altitude advantage, executing our attacks exactly as we had been taught. And the Corsairs would simply accelerate away from us, climbing faster than we could follow, then reversing to attack us from a position of advantage. After enough of these engagements, you stopped thinking about tactics or fighting spirit. You thought about mathematics. How many Corsairs were there? How many Zeros did we have left? How long before the ratio became impossible? The mathematics were indeed impossible. By August 1945, Japan had fewer than 5,000 operational aircraft remaining, and most of those were reserved for kamikaze attacks, a final admission that conventional air combat against American fighters had become unwinnable. The United States Navy and Marine Corps operated over 7,000 Corsairs in frontline service, supported by extensive reserves and ongoing production. The industrial disparity that Japanese planners had underestimated in 1941 had manifested as an avalanche of steel and aluminum that buried Japan's air forces under sheer material weight. The Corsair's legacy extended beyond its kill statistics. It remained in production until 1952, long after the war ended. It flew combat missions in Korea, where it proved effective in close air support roles against ground targets. Some foreign air forces operated Corsairs into the 1960s. The basic airframe design, built around that massive R-2800 engine, proved adaptable enough to remain relevant through multiple generations of warfare. This longevity illustrated another advantage that Japanese planners had failed to anticipate. American aircraft designs had built-in margins for improvement and modification that Japanese fighters lacked. The Zero that Sakai flew in 1943 was essentially identical to the Zero that fought at Pearl Harbor in 1941. Minor variants improved some characteristics, but the fundamental airframe and engine combination had reached its development ceiling. The Corsair that entered service in 1943 was continuously improved throughout the war. Engine output increased, armor was enhanced, weapons loads expanded. By 1945, the F4U-4 variant was faster, better armed, and more capable than the original F4U-1, while still using the same basic airframe. This capacity for iterative improvement reflected industrial depth that Japan simply did not possess. For Japanese pilots who survived the war, the Corsair became a reference point for understanding how completely they had misunderstood the enemy they were fighting. Lieutenant Nishizawa Hiroyoshi, the pilot who had described the Zero as a sword forged by the gods in 1942, was killed in October 1944 when the transport aircraft carrying him was shot down by American fighters. His final letters home, later published by his family, revealed a man who had lost faith not in his own abilities, but in the strategic assumptions that had led Japan into an unwinnable war. We were told that Americans were soft, that they lacked our dedication and our willingness to sacrifice. But when I see their aircraft, when I fight against their pilots who keep coming back mission after mission, I understand that we were lied to. They are not soft. They have simply built a war machine that operates on different principles than ours. They do not need to sacrifice everything, because they have enough of everything. Their pilots fly aircraft with armor that keeps them alive. They eject from damaged planes and return to fight another day. They replace losses faster than we can inflict them. This is not weakness. This is a kind of strength we did not understand and cannot match. The final accounting of the Corsair's impact goes beyond the 2,140 aircraft it destroyed. It includes the thousands of Japanese pilots who modified their tactics, who avoided engagements with Corsairs even when it meant abandoning other mission objectives, who returned to base with aircraft intact, but morale shattered by the realization that they were fighting with obsolete tools against an enemy with unlimited resources. It includes the Japanese commanders who had to explain to their superiors why air superiority was no longer achievable, why bombers could not reach American carriers, why forward bases could not be defended against American air attacks. The Corsair's 2,380 horsepower engine was more than a technical specification. It was a statement about industrial capacity, about what happens when a fully mobilized continental economy focuses its manufacturing might on military production. Every Corsair represented thousands of tons of high-grade aluminum that had to be smelted, machined, and assembled. Every R-2800 engine represented precision manufacturing at a scale Japan could not replicate. Every squadron of Corsairs represented a logistics network that could deliver fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and trained pilots to forward bases across the Pacific. Japanese planners had known in 1941 that America's industrial capacity exceeded Japan's, but they had not understood what that meant in practical terms. They had not imagined fighters with engines twice as powerful as anything Japan could build. They had not anticipated that American aircraft would get progressively better, while Japanese aircraft stagnated or declined. They had not foreseen that American pilot losses would be replaced faster than Japanese losses, despite Japan's smaller population. The Corsair forced them to confront these miscalculations every time it appeared in the sky over a Japanese position. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Corsair had become the standard against which all other fighters were measured. It had achieved what its designers intended, air superiority through overwhelming power. But it had also revealed something deeper about the nature of industrial warfare in the 20th century. Wars between industrial nations would be won not by the side with better training or superior fighting spirit, but by the side that could produce more steel, more aluminum, more engines, more aircraft, and more trained personnel to use them. The Zero had represented Japan's best effort to build a competitive fighter within the constraints of limited resources. The Corsair represented what happened when those constraints didn't exist. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.